there's something going on culturally that people are looking for a framework. I think Christianity is well placed to be the non-anxious framework, primarily because of Jesus. Our problem with church is it's a bit like church Tinder. This swipe left or swipe right because this church is advertising itself a certain way, and that fits my profile, and that fits. Hang on, that's probably bought into the cultural moment far more than we would like to admit.
Hey there, you're listening to the Upside Down People podcast. This is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with Jesus-loving people. You can show the show some love by leaving us a rating or review and sharing it with your family and friends. As always, I'm your host, Caleb, and I'll be having a conversation with Stephen McAlpine today. Steve's a pastor, author, blogger, ex-journalist, and whose book, Being the Bad Guys, was awarded the 2021 Australian Christian Book of the Year. He's also the host of the Undeception's DeLorean podcast, where he answers pressing and relevant societal questions. In this conversation, we talk about identity, individuality, and how cultural formation happens both in society and in the church that we find ourselves. We also talk about the impact that ChatGPT may or may not have on creativity and writing. It's a great conversation, so without holding it back any further, let's jump into it. With us, we have Stephen McAlpine, pastor, author, blogger, ex-journalist, and you live in one of the finest cities in the world, Perth. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Oh, it's great to be with you. And it is a fine Perth day as we talk.
It is.
Way too hot.
Temperatures are soaring today and especially this week, right?
I know. It's typical, isn't it?
It is. I did say you live in one of the finest cities, but you mentioned that you're thinking of relocating.
Yes, thinking to another fine city on the eastern side.
To another fine city.
Not as hot.
Not as hot, yeah. So finer in other ways.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't possibly say.
Yeah.
I don't want to betray Perth like that.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I thought in terms of just to get to know you, a good introduction would be maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, your family, what you enjoy doing, a couple of hobbies. Yeah.
So I'm Steve from Northern Ireland originally. And my wife Jill is from South Africa. So we're both first-generation migrant families.
Right.
You come with just your parents and the kids, and now as you're getting a bit older, that sort of grows a little bit, and that's where we're at. And but originally from Belfast, and I have a twin brother, an identical twin brother as well. So
right.
Two Irish boys at school when you're young who are identical. People remember you for all sorts of reasons, I think, when you meet up with people again. So fairly busy, I think. My wife is a clinical psych. I have a 23-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old son, nearly 16. And life is, that busy bit, that's different to the busy bit when you have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old or whatever it is. And I watch people like that, and it's interesting.
Yeah, you've sort of regaining your sleep, but then
you do. You lose it for different reasons.
You lose it. I was going to say you lose it for different reasons. Yeah,
do with older children, but that we're fairly close family, and so we lived in Perth together. It's Perth mainly that we've lived, and life is busy, as I said, but we do find a little bit of time to do things. Hobbies for me, running. And runners will always tell you they're runners. No one else in the family runs, but
really,
yeah, often over the years, but not to the point that I do. So I use it as a de-stressing thing, I think.
Right. Do you run with music or anything like that?
No.
Just the pure form.
Yes, and just laundering out all the noise in your head, I think.
Yeah.
Part of ministry life over the years has been just running by yourself. I sometimes run with other people, but I think I did 10 laps of this big 3-kilometer block the other day near us, and literally it was zoning out time. I thought, I'm going to zone out and I have to run past my house 10 times and I'm not stopping to go in.
Right.
And after that I feel like defragged.
You feel great. Yeah.
Didn't feel great, I have to say. My brain was okay. But I guess the other thing, Jill and I like sort of modernism and mid-century kind of things like that. So we like to, occasionally go to the odd modernist kind of show, and We like that kind of aesthetic. So,
Okay. What does that look like for someone who isn't quite...
Right, yeah, that's interesting because maybe it's because we're both very tidy, ordered people in the house. Maybe because the rest of life is a bit disordered.
Yeah.
That it's very, sort of the Scandinavian look with a bit of a softer touch, not brutalist, but kind of very clean lines, form and function.
Yeah.
And that's our house. In fact, there's a standing joke almost on Facebook because we've got a very ordered, structured, squared off looking house. It's very modernist, and there's a very small vert green lawn at the front, and I mow it and I stand out the front of it at the end of mowing it after I've showered and dressed. I'm just right underneath the search for order because I know the grass will grow again and it'll look untidy again. It's that constant need for order. So Jill and I kind of live that, sort of slowly try to be a bit more ordered in the house because the rest of life is a little bit more chaotic.
Yeah. I really love that simplistic, minimalist lifestyle. It is getting increasingly harder, like as we have kids.
Yes.
Especially when they're young. So it's like they have like their books and their toys, and like they need to be entertained. And then them just as little humans, like they'll be pulling things off everywhere. And
you suddenly realise as you get older, when you have young kids come around, how unchild-proof your house becomes over time.
Yes.
Because you don't have children and your house is not child-proof, and then you have children and suddenly everything is a risk.
Yeah.
And then gradually those risks dissolve, and then someone comes around with a 1-year-old and you're going, oh, I didn't think about that.
I didn't think, yeah, exactly. And the other thing as well is because, as you can see, we're in a pretty small apartment, so the constant like awareness of like, man, I have so much stuff is, where do you put it? But it's also having to take into consideration the size of the apartment so small. So it's like,
that's right.
Do we just start culling everything and live like just with a single couch and like...
And that's the luxury of living in Australia in the 21st century. If you think about how people would have lived in Europe, and still do in many places. But there's a great show on YouTube called Apartment Therapy, which is a little bit of the sort of self-satisfied single person in a New York apartment curating their stuff.
Yeah.
And it just looks so non-kid friendly, and everything looks like it's in its place. And you can just see, someone would, if someone came in with a child, that apartment, the person in the apartment would need other kind of therapy after.
Yeah, so good. So that's, thanks for sharing a bit about that. I've noticed you have 2 tattoos, visible ones.
I do.
What do they mean?
Well, I've got one that's the Greek word for the age or the age to come. So that's my theological reminder. Also a reminder that we don't live for this age.
Right.
And the tattoo ages with me. I've had it maybe 15 years.
Yeah, okay.
And then I have a writer's ink pen on my other arm.
Is that a nod to journalism?
Yeah, nod to my writing career.
Yeah, okay.
I've had to get a running one, so those are my 3 things. But the age to come one was the first one as I thought about aging, actually.
Right.
And Jesus talks about the age to come, and we should live for the age to come, not this age. But it will age. I've noticed it age in grey.
Yeah.
As I age in grey. So it feels like a picture of Dorian Gray, your picture getting old.
Yeah.
My skin getting old.
That's great. Very, very, got deep meaning to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I went into a tattoo parlor and said, find some Chinese symbol that was, fried chicken and rice, and they told me it was something meaningful.
Yeah.
I did a bit of research.
That's probably shows the difference in generations, right? Because I have some friends who have literally gone and got a tattoo of an avocado surfing toast.
Yes, I have nephews that do that, and I guess I like coffee, and you go to any cafe, and there's no self-respecting barista that doesn't have 20-odd tattoos in a sort of 1920s style.
Yes.
And just like, I'd like to know the link between all of them, but there isn't one.
No.
That's the point.
Yeah. I'm sure they all have a story, whether it's short or,
that's right.
or long. Cool. And then just before, I am curious to pick your brains a bit about some thoughts and ideas that you had in your book, Being the Bad Guys. And then I'm sure you constantly in this cultural space of thinking about how to apply theology and how society interacts and engages with theology. But something I have recently liked to do is just to humanize you a bit. So we've done a bit of humanizing, put some flesh to you, but maybe you can share a high that you've gone through in your life and a low that you've gone through in your life.
That's interesting. I'm going to say the high is being married to my wife, and
great answer.
Yeah, I guess that sounds like the motherhood and apple pie answer, but it's not, and it's because she's been there in the lows. The low in my life was definitely a church plant split and getting very ill at the same time and being in hospital and having major surgery. And I remember lying in hospital bed thinking, you kind of bottom out when life's like that and you can't move and someone's got to bath you in the bed. That's horrible.
Yeah.
Dignity goes right there. But I remember Jill, my wife, saying to me afterwards, if I'd seen the last 2 years coming, I wouldn't have wanted them. But on the other side of them, we couldn't have done without them.
Wow.
That's putting my high and low together, I think. And I think that's how God works, by breaking you. And I think perhaps it was about the age of 42, 43, you can operate in your own strengths very easily. And I have particular gifts that are fairly out there, and they have a bit of capital in the sense that I can speak and write and speak publicly. And I feel that God kind of deconstructed me a little bit. It put me back together again, but it made me a less brittle person.
Yeah.
I think that stood me in good stead, I think.
Yeah.
So the low and the high, they kind of combine, but I wouldn't have done without them, as Jill said.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing those. So let's jump into it. So your book, Being the Bad Guys, great book. I had a read through it and loved it. Maybe you can give us a quick snapshot into what it was about and why you wrote it.
Yeah, two good questions. The book's really about why the temperature for Christians, Orthodox Christianity, got dialed up a lot. It felt like it was a lot hotter engagement, at least at the public square level, that Christianity was no longer seen as part of the solution in our cultural moment, but as part of the problem, especially in the areas of identity, gender, exclusivity of Jesus, though that one's dialed down a little bit at the moment. But it was a case of how do we get to the stage where to believe in Orthodox Christianity is seen as something that could be oppressive to people. And I've done a postmodern lit degree years ago as well, so I could see the whole, the power thing at work and identity questions, and what that feels like in the current climate, and what it means to be a Christian who, no matter what you might be a lovely, kind person, if people find out what you think about certain things, it can get you kicked to the curb pretty quickly. And not just privately, but also in a workplace setting. It was quite hostile, especially a few years ago. Why I wrote it? Partly because I've been a pastor for a long time, and it was interesting that people in church were saying, it's a lot harder being a Christian these days in my workplace than it used to be.
Right.
And for pastors who went into ministry maybe 30 years ago, when you went in, it was taking a hit for the team. You're doing the hard thing. It feels the other way around.
Yeah.
And I'm preaching to people on Sunday for whom Monday is a Babylon experience dialed up a little bit.
Right.
It isn't as easy to say to them, well, look, go out evangelize and tell people about Jesus around the water cooler. That whole Jesus question has a huge iceberg under the tip that people want to know. Are you one of those, I've had that. Are you one of those evangelicals? And what they mean by that is, are you one of those people I see on the news in America who, whatever.
Yeah, protesting funerals or...
holding signs up that are angry. And then no pastors seem to have been preparing people for that conversation as readily. And I think that's something we needed to think about. So I wrote it pastorally in the hope that it would help people navigate that space. So I was giving a map of how we got here and what's it feel like, and started to touch on where's it going, but I kind of left that off a little bit.
Yeah.
At that book.
Yeah. And I'm guessing in your next book, Futureproof, you'll...
Yes, that's right. It feels like ending a series on a cliffhanger, doesn't it? Futureproof, subtitle of that is how to live for Jesus in a culture that's always changing. And part of the reason I wrote that was, we've looked at how do we get here philosophically, which is post-Christian? What does it feel like? It feels like a cage fight. It feels a little bit harder. It feels like an away game rather than a home game for Christianity. This next book is about, so as a church, how do we move forward in the next 3 decades? You can't predict everything, but you can predict trends and where things are going. And we live in a world of what we call rapid discontinuous change.
What does that mean?
Well, it feels like you're strapped yourself in, but you're not in a cable car going to a progressive future.
Right.
You're in a roller coaster.
Yeah.
What's coming next? Which direction's it going? And there's a lot of anxiety culturally at the moment.
Right.
About who we are, where we're going. And the conceit of the book is really that the car from Back to the Future arrives in your church car park in 2023 from your church in 2053.
Right.
And what does it mean to prepare to be a faithful, flourishing Christian community in 2053? Well, you've got to start putting some stuff in place now. How do we disciple ourselves into that rather than wait for 15 years and then sort stuff out? That can't happen. You've got to start now.
Yeah, it's that difference between that reactive approach and the thought through response.
Yes, because we don't want to be the anxious people ourselves. And Mark Sayer's book, A Non-Anxious Presence, is a really good book about how do you dial that down? How do you be leaders and Christians who are the non-anxious people in the sense?
Yeah. Yeah, he does mention that in his book, right? In times of chaos, people are drawn to a centered person, someone who's assured and is not swept by all these things happening. And you start seeing glimpses of that, I think, in our Western culture today, even though there is pushback on, I suppose, people who are like forthcoming with their faith.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, there seems to be a deeper level of respect, maybe.
It's what I call repellent. They're repellently attractive.
Repellently, that's a great way.
I don't like your faith. I don't like what you Christians believe. But that guy has an ordered life. It's like he's going in a direction that has meaning and purpose. And I think that's a critical thing. Because I think in being the bad guys, it's going to get tough. And I think it will in Futureproof as I wrote it. But I think there's some green shoots of people going, we can't keep going like this.
Right.
There's got to be some framework. And you see that framework come through, perhaps in a secular way, though it's got a Christianized frame to Jordan Peterson, for example. So one question I've asked a lot of Christians is, how come young men who won't darken the door of our churches buy a book called 12 Rules for Life and line up to hear someone speak for 2.5 hours?
Yeah.
That's a big question. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson's got everything right, but I don't think he's got everything wrong either.
Yeah.
And I think there's something going on culturally that people are looking for a framework. And if we don't give them a good framework, they could get a bad one.
Yeah.
It's very easy to do that. So I think Christianity is well placed to be the non-anxious framework, primarily because of Jesus.
Yeah.
He told us not to be anxious. And if you read the accounts in the Gospels where he's predicting the ends of the times and the apocalyptic times, he's not doing it to scare people or get them to write speculative books about it.
Right.
He's doing it to get you to say, let's trust in God in this situation.
Yeah, very good. The Jordan Peterson one's an interesting one. I find it interesting as well, particularly because it attracts and empowers males. So what we're seeing, I think, in society today is that deconstruction of what masculinity looks like or what it should look like, and it's almost demonized.
Yes. And I did read something that said, by a woman writer in a fairly conservative journal, but the way she described what a man looked like, I went, well, that does not sound like the average person I know who's a man. But why does that need to be that? It feels like there's a lot of young blokes in Perth who are sort of the average tradie going, well, I'm not a tertiary educated person with a liberal arts degree who wants to celebrate a fluid identity.
Right.
I'm a bloke. And, but to be told, therefore, that you are, therefore, your masculinity is wrong, I think that's not helpful.
No.
And they would look for it in the Andrew Tates of this world, which feels like a very transactional kind of way of doing masculinity.
Right.
In an unhealthy way. But if you're not going to present them something that they can actually recognize as a man and then present it well, you find people going to these extremes. But I don't think Jordan Peterson's the extreme. He's saying there's something about order and that I think is important. And people are actually asking those questions at the moment. We're in a disordered world asking questions about order.
Yeah. And it's amazing how, as humans, we desire that at a deep level. We need it. We need that order. It almost points back to the fall, right? Of in Genesis.
Yeah, well, it does, because that's my comment about mowing my lawn and the search for order.
Yeah,
right? There's a theological book called The Search for Order on eschatology. So we are looking for order, rightly ordered. And so what we notice in our own lives, and this is sort of Augustinian in that level, that we have disordered lives and disordered loves, especially. And the gospel is supposed to bring order to our lives, not in uniformity ways, but in some sort of unity, cohesion. So we know that our own lives are disordered when one part of our life says this and another part of our life is living the opposite to that.
Right.
And so order is so much about God bringing good order, because God is a God of order. We read that in the New Testament, not just simply about the garden, but God is a God of order in the church, not uniformity, but order.
Yeah.
And I think order without God can, become fascism or whatever it can become.
Yeah.
But with God, order is a good thing. We want order. I want to get up in the morning because God is a God of order and look out and know that the sun is rising, that there isn't a capricious God up there who's had an argument with another God and somehow the sun didn't rise today.
Yeah.
You want a God of order.
Exactly, yeah. And it reminds me of, I think it was Dostoevsky. I never can pronounce
Dostoevsky. I'll try it again.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try it again. He says, if there is no God, everything is permitted. So it's that idea, exactly what you're saying is, without God, there's chaos.
No one wants to admit that, because to admit that admits it in. And so the Christian framework has given to the West a sense of order and meaning and purpose that has, not just to the West, but to the world. Glenn Scrivener's book, he's got a book called The Air We Breathe.
Yeah.
Great book about, we just naturally assume that there's an ordered framework to the world, even if we reject the gospel.
Yeah. We're actually having a conversation with him soon as well. Yeah. About that. Yeah.
And he really picks the eyes out of that exceptionally well. And Tom Holland, obviously, when you say Tom Holland as my age, half the audience is looking for a guy in blue and red spandex. And
the other half is looking forward.
Yeah, he's in town soon, actually, Tom Holland. But when Tom Holland says that it's the revolution that won, that's invisible to your eyes. It's the half-baked losing revolutions that you notice. So you see their burnt-out tanks and their failed attempts at planting a flag. But the revolution that wins the day becomes almost seamless in the cultural moment. And Christianity is that revolution. It's shaped us beyond belief. And you think about how science even works, and just the fact that the Christian framework gave rise to an ordered science in a way that the Aztecs thought you had to kill your children by the bucket load to get the sun, and and the Spanish, when they arrived, could not comprehend that these people have not got an ordered framework in that, and that because it was the air they breathed, Christianity.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So just shifting gears just slightly, it definitely has to do with what we're talking about in your book, and it sounds like you've done a deep amount of thinking into these areas of individuality and identity. But I'm keen to have a conversation as well around what is individuality, choice, freedom. In your book, you go over the two problems the capital I, or the individual world faces, are loneliness and insecurity. So maybe you can explain a bit about why that is.
Yeah. Look, the Bible does honor the individual. And I think what happens when you untether that individual the primacy of the individual from God, who creates the individual. You get the individual as God. And the individual as God cannot bear the weight of what it means to be an individual fully without God. And I guess expressive individualism, which is the term that Robert Bellah, the sociologist, came up with to describe what it means, that my point in life is to know who I truly am inside and express that to the world. And somehow that's me being authentic. That's the individualism that we have about identity, that who I think I am is a discrete thing external to the community to which I may belong.
Right.
The point of your life is not to subsume yourself into the community. Dale Kuhn calls that the T world, the traditional world,
right,
in his book Sex and the I World, but to express yourself. And so much of that has become around sexuality and gender identity, which is the psychological self is your true self, who you think you are. Yet at the same time, that's very fragile because it's shape-shifting all the time. And Tim Keller says that despite all of the individual framework that we have to live, the self is exceptionally fragile in our current culture because it's all on you. Taylor Swift gave the commencement address at New York University in 2022. That's amazing, right? Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Because she speaks for millions. And she said, how can I give advice to this many people? I won't. Scary news is you're on your own now. Cool news is you're on your own now. That is the mantra of our culture. It's cool if it works. If it falls apart,
yeah,
we got one person to blame.
Yeah.
You.
That's a pretty big load or burden to carry, right?
That's why our psychology practices are booked out by 6 months, because everyone's anxious about that question.
Yeah.
Who am I? It's a big question.
It's huge. And you're right, in terms of mental health, issues have dramatically increased in the past, well, especially over COVID, but in the past decade. There's a huge rise in it, and it doesn't seem like it's dropping off anytime soon.
And my wife said that before COVID, mental health was the primary issue, and COVID didn't make it happen, just revealed it.
Yeah.
Especially if you strip away the props. So you can hold the individual self up really, really well in a well-ordered and well-functioning and society that rewards you for your individuality. But you take away some of the props, you take away some of the freedoms, you take away some of the rewards that you get in a Western life, working hard, going on holiday, whatever those things are, and the individual suddenly gets exposed.
Yeah.
And that dials up that anxiety level.
It starts collapsing.
Yep.
So then how does the secular view of individualism or freedom and dignity and joy compare to the biblical view?
That's an interesting question. I think it piggybacks off the biblical view because the secular framework is really post-Christian. It's just Christianity without the Christianity.
Right.
Tom Holland would say that the progressive and conservative perspective in our culture are just the Christianity at civil war with itself, two sides. But the secular question is interesting that you can't take an ought from an is, and secularism says we got to have these issues of dignity and et cetera, but there's no framework for saying why or how far. Or those you can't really make one other than you have to fall back onto communal aspects if you're going to do an ethic,
right? Because
otherwise society falls apart.
Is that sort of something that's currently happening? Would you say?
Yeah, I think we've still got the vestige of Christianity. We're not Christian in a kind of Christian way, but less so than we maybe were 40 years ago. We were non-Christians in a very Christian way for 40 years ago, but it's starting to fade away. The secular frame is struggling with meaning and purpose in life.
Right.
Despite the fact that it gives you a lot of experience. Mark Sayers says that the experience bucket is very full in the West and the meaning and purpose bucket is very empty. Now, COVID showed that when the experience bucket gets drained because you're locked down and you can't do what you used to do, everyone's is falling apart because...
where's their meaning and purpose?
Yeah. These experiences anaesthetize you from the lack of meaning and purpose issues.
Right.
That isn't to say everyone in a secular frame doesn't have meaning and purpose. But you want to say, what's the meaning and purpose behind your meaning and purpose? It becomes a bit of an onion layer. You can't get to the center of what that is in a secular frame. And nowadays in the West, it's express yourself,
Right.
who you are. And that's why in a secular frame, when you take a religious Christian framework out of that, you'll find there are more and more laws. You've got to multiply the number of laws because people are less and less cohered around a central framework. And you'll find that you just become more legalistic in some senses.
That's fascinating because the more laws you have, the more that inhibits someone else's freedom or someone else's expressive individuality, right?
Yeah. And then you start to barter. Which ones are more important than others? And suddenly you've got, well, someone's making a decision that this life is more important than that life, or that way of expressing yourself is more important than that way of... Who gets to decide that?
Right.
And I guess if you go back to Genesis, there was one no and a million yeses. And you break the no, and then it starts to be laws to try and fence you away from all the no's.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It's super fascinating. And I think even maybe going a step further, it seems like in Western culture, there's this need to not just express your individuality, but now there's a need that you would validate me expressing my individuality.
Or else.
Yeah. There would be consequences.
That shows the fragility. And we don't have the public square cannot hold different things in tension very well at the moment. And I would also say that the post-Christian experience is very Christian in the sense that there's a new set of laws, there's a new priesthood, there's a new kind of saint, there's a new kind of sinner, and it feels very hostile. And Douglas Murray had said in his book, The Madness of Crowds, that we don't have anyone to offer us redemption.
Yeah.
We don't know who would offer it to us, and whether it's a better offer than what he called an endless fiery cycle of denunciation. Sounds fantastic.
It does, yeah. He's got a really optimistic look on society.
Well, it's interesting that he also says, when pushed, that he's atheist in a kind of Christian way.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what many of these people like Tom Holland and like Jordan Peterson and like Douglas Murray do. And now A.N. Hersey Ali, who was previously a Muslim, then an atheist, and now says she's Christian. They recognize that the Christian framework, the fruit of the gospel, is something that we want in our society. And many people do, even if they don't want the roots of it. Now, a good example of that is Christian schooling. At a time when the culture seems to be becoming more secular, Christian faith-based schooling in Australia, you can't get your kids in. Secular people can't because they want to.
Right.
Because they want the framework.
Yeah.
Even if they say, well, I don't want my kid to become a Christian and end up on the mission field out somewhere. I want him to be a good lawyer.
Yeah.
Can you do that for me? Can we have that fruit that you've got without those roots?
That is fascinating. It's and you go a bit into this in your book as well. It's I want the king without the kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's Mark Sayer's statement, like riffing off him. But there's a flip side to it. So I think the king without the kingdom is a little bit of that progressive I world thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a flip side. I'll have Christendom without Christ. If you give me the 1950s back with all its conservatism, but I don't need Jesus in it. Just give me a very conservative way of doing life, white picket fence kind of look, make it very moralistic, but I don't need Jesus. Whereas this one has a different moralism, it's a different framework, but it's the king without the king, kingdom without the king. And I think Christendom without Christ and kingdom without king, those are those two warring factions.
Yeah, conflicting. So what's your thoughts then in terms of the impact of Christendom without Christ or a king without the kingdom?
What you're going to get on one side is is the gender identity sexuality thing. That's the progressive
right
without the king. We want the human rights, but we'll decide who's human.
Very good.
Which is, you'll notice that we want the right of the individual to determine how their life progresses, including if they want to die at the age of 50 because they feel unhappy. And you see legislations coming in. So that's very much progressive kingdom without the king, because they value the individual at one level,
right?
But we get to decide who the individual is rather than that's something that God has ordained. I think of the Christ without Christendom, or Christendom without Christ model, we want conformity. We want to look like a society. We're just going to get rid of all that nonsense. No one was ever a victim. You go, hang on, some people were victims.
Yeah.
It's not true that people weren't victimized by the conservative culture. It's true. But we're not going back there, but there are ways of going forward that have good order in them that the gospel gives. And somehow both of those things have to be held in tension, that the value of the individual under the basis of the gospel and the value of the community under the basis of the gospel. Because without the gospel, with the community, you get uniformity in a way that's a little bit, you've got to be very careful of, I think. And over here, you just get this Nova effect of everyone just being who they want to be and how they want to be.
Yeah, and I suppose the effect of that is if you're your own God, you don't really know who you want to be. So it's just this continual chaos of trying to figure that out.
Well, it's interesting that there is, off the back of, for people who have got lots of social capital.
Yeah.
Because if you want to go through 15 different relationships and 8 different children and all that, and you're in Hollywood, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
You do that anywhere else, you're in a trailer park.
Yeah.
Right? Because that doesn't work. So what you find at that level, though, is that people that promulgate some of those ideas live actually very conservative lives themselves. They live in gated communities. Their kids all go to the same kind of school. They all intermarry each other at early ages and go to the same kind of universities. And it's kind of a protected species at the same time that they're promulgating, be yourself, do what you want.
Yeah.
They don't live like that because they know it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's horrible.
Yeah, that's right. What are you selling us?
Exactly. So let's talk a bit about cultural formation now. How does our culture disciple and form us? We've gone a bit into this, and then verse how Jesus disciples and forms us.
The same way, but from the opposite direction. The culture disciples and informs us through immersive experience, I think. And James K.A. Smith talks about that.
Yeah.
Cultural liturgies. That what I'd be saying is that what's on offer in the cultural frame is a gospel, is a discipleship program that will form you through the people you spend time with, through the things you watch. Social media has ramped it up big time. But it's an immersive experience that says, this is what meaning and purpose looks like, and we will put you in a plausibility structure that both confirms that and also heightens its reality for you. So it's that sort of the secular age has done that big time to us. I think that plausibility structure thing, and that thing that Charles Taylor talks about in A Secular Age, where it's the water you're swimming in. It's just that whole thing. Christianly, you kind of want to be. It's the community of God's people together that disciple us, which is why individual Christians out there on their own isn't the ideal. It's the gospel community. It's central. We've obviously got the power of the Holy Spirit to shape and change us, but we're also drawn to the other. It's not like we're going, ooh, yuck, look at that terrible sinful world. The Bible says sin is attractive.
Yeah.
It just doesn't last.
Yeah.
So they're both formative communities. And the question is, can this community form you in a way that will counter and repel this one? And it feels like sometimes it's a bit of a battle as we look at our cultural moment, especially younger generations coming through. And I think the key to this formation program is that it doesn't have to be more spectacular than this one. It's just got to embed itself in you in such a way that it gives you greater depth of meaning and understanding and framework. Because this one will offer you that. And the only way to deal with it is first expose this as facile, but also show that this one is deeper and richer. And the question then becomes, is it?
Yeah.
No, it's not, it should be. The question is it?
Right.
And that's where I think the next 30 years is going to really have to work hard with the church to say, how are we doing life together as God's people in such ways that don't just pay homage to Jesus at one level, but kind of tie in for this one? Because I say it, I write a lot about the radical nature of the sexual revolution and gender fluidity, all that stuff, bad life. But the good life's just as likely to take you away from Jesus as the bad life, because Jesus himself says that you sow the seed sown where the weeds are. The gospel fruit's taken away by the desire for other things, the lure of wealth, all those things.
Yeah.
And if we have a discipleship program that says, come once every 3 weeks, and, because we're going down to South the other weekend and there's a party on, so we might pop into the late service with the kids that week. You go, you're cycling your children to say that the good life is actually more attractive and more compelling than life with Jesus.
Yeah.
Because self-denial is part of this Jesus life, not self-expression necessarily.
Yeah.
And we baptize the good life by the way we live our lives, I think.
That seems like it's a bit of a discipline as well to engage in that, because I think, say, that's a great example you use, like going on a trip down south with the family or something like that, and
good things.
Really good things. Particularly if you live in a place like WA where it's warm day, let's go to the beach. It's instead of going to church or something like that, or go to the pub, have a drink with friends, or whatever it may be. They're good things, but there's a discipline in being able to say, I value this church community and I'm going to commit to going there because there's something healthy. I'm going to be formed by it. And I think that's something particularly my generation struggles with in thinking about, say, that you mentioned social media. So social media is really invasive in the way that there's people who are far smarter than I am, devoting all their time, energy, and effort into gaining my attention. And they do a great job at that. So there's a discipline in saying no to that, because I know it's bad, but it's hard to say no to that, and then saying yes to something that I know is good, but it's also hard to say yes to.
Yes, and I look, there's a joyous discipline in being with the people of God, and the fruit is there over the long period. Example, my daughter at uni, or when she was in year 12 at school, I think, her friend said to her, how come you've been to so many weddings? And she said, because my friends who are 25, 26 are getting married. He said, who has 25 to 26-year-old friends? I'll tell you who does. Christians.
Yeah.
When they're 17, because the 26-year-old friends when they were 20 and my daughter was 11 were hanging out with her. The older girls were taking the younger girls out for a milkshake, a Bible read, bookshop, St. Vinny's, go off shopping and hanging out as a community.
Yeah.
And my daughter's non-Christian friends didn't have that, and don't have it at university either. And so when the world says, hey, here's a great way of doing life, my daughter goes, well, I'm good. You know what I mean? So it's not as like it's more than my job's worth to or through the Christian experience, because I don't think it is. I think it's joyous. And my experience during, and I've said, use this story in my book, but in my first book, but one of my running friends, did I mention I'm a runner? They all tell you. She's a lapsed Irish Catholic, and we've run thousands of kilometres together as marathon training. And she said to me after COVID, I envy you Christians. I said, you can't envy us Christians. You're a lapsed Irish Catholic. You're going to hate us. And she goes, no, during COVID, the way the run club Christians in the run clubs run by a great Christian guy as a pastor, well worth an interview with, I think. The way you cared for each other was just automatic.
Yeah.
You just did it. Now, they involved her and brought her into it. But she said, I didn't have any of that from any of my other friends. It's like, we didn't have to sit down and roster how we were going to look after other Christians, really.
Yeah.
We just did it because we're brothers and sisters in Christ. And beautiful. I think there's something about that. And she was envious of that. She realized she didn't have that. And I think we just don't realize how good we have it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that.
I agree 100%. One of the questions I actually had that I wanted to get your thoughts on, which I think you've answered, is what role does the little C, the local church, play in Christian formation? And I think you've sort of alluded to the fact that it plays a detrimental role. And it's a beautiful place to commit yourself to because of that formation over a long
Yeah, and that's what it is. If you're looking for high impact smoke and mirrors, you can get that anywhere. And you can get a, spiritual experience somewhere else, for want of a better word, spiritual.
Yeah.
My wife and I went to the Nick Cave concert last year in December. I still remember it because it was like a spiritual experience.
Right.
Yeah. Lots of concerts are. It was, and he's a particular God-fearing person, so there was an aspect of that to it, which showed that people want something more than what they're getting. But it's the drip-filtered day-to-day Christian life where all the mini no to me and mini yes to someone else adds up.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying in my second book. You can't take out of the bank what you haven't put in. If it gets to a really difficult time in life that just explodes onto the cultural scene or the global scene, you're going to have to draw down what you've got. It's very hard to sort of upload what's not there.
Yeah.
So I think the churches over the next 30 years, as we see the tectonic plate shift culturally, are just going to have to embed themselves in local Christian communities. And part of that is, can you live in the same place for long enough that you get to know people when their kids are 1, 5, 15, 20, married, where you know each other long enough that you can call out each other's sin, pray for each other in your sickness, be on your deathbeds together.
Yeah, very good.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very controversial statement in this generation where it's countercultural because, again, speaking to the individuality, it's like I don't know where I'm going to be in a year's time. Maybe
I don't want you to press me on it either.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah,
because you're doing violence to my individuality.
Yeah. But that's why I think everything you're saying I love, because there's a beauty in the local church. It's like a marriage in that sense where you get the true enjoyment and the true transformation that it was, and see what it was designed for, the more you journey with it.
It's not like it's not got its issues, right?
No, not at all.
And I think John Dixon was talking about learning to play the cello poorly.
Right.
And then went on to a concert stage and played with other people poorly. He played the piece of music. But the piece of music is beautiful and played well. It's amazing. But he knew that every expression of church or the way we do Christianity, it can be clunky. We see bad things all the time, and social media allows us to put up the bad stuff in real time.
Yeah.
Right? And we see that often, and I have seen it, and I've experienced it. And that's the thing: the most hurt I've ever had has been from a church experience.
Yeah.
But the highs I've ever had have been from a church experience, and that's because I take my view of sin seriously and my view of salvation seriously. That I can hold both of those things in tension. And when Tim Keller used to say, cheer up. You're worse than you think you are, and you're more loved than you dare hope.
Yeah,
that's the reality. That's who we are. But when you see church work well, or little bits of church just do little glimmers of light, you see that's where the future's headed.
Yeah, and it's far better, especially in this day and age, to be doing life with people than life without.
100%. And look, the other thing I'd say is, our problem with church is it's a bit like church Tinder. This swipe left or swipe right because this church is advertising itself a certain way, and that fits my profile, and that fits. Hang on, that's probably bought into the cultural moment far more than we would like to admit.
That's a great point you bring up. So what would you say to someone ascribing to that mentality?
I'd be saying, if church is not about self-expression, but churches can be about serving others, where would you end up in church? If it's not about self-serving and it's not about you getting what you need, where is the best place where you can serve others? Because the same thing is true of marriage. Marriage has changed its definition in our Western setting because we see it as a relationship of choice, which I find the right romantic sexual partner. It doesn't matter who they are. Their job is to fulfill me. Whereas marriage, according to the Bible, is to serve the other in a mutual relationship of obligation.
Yeah,
at that level, and church has to be a little bit like that. It's relationships of mutual obligation that are tightly bound by the power of the Holy Spirit into a body.
Yeah, very good.
And we read those passages, yeah. And then we go, but I'm going somewhere else. And as a pastor, the thing I used to be frustrated with was the average 50-year-old whose kids were 15, 14 and 11 coming to church, and you ask them, where have you been to church recently? And they name 6 different places over the last 10 years. And go, no wonder your kids look dispirited.
Yeah.
And you can't you'll form them into choice more than you'll form them into Jesus.
So me and my wife have recently had a few different conversations around why do we not see more elder men and women who are engaged, particularly elder men, I'm not too sure why, but who are engaged in a local church body. And I think there's something lost in that, but I'm not too sure why, where there's like generations coming up. So that you almost get like that mid between 18 and 50. And maybe, without being too dark, maybe people are dying. I'm not too sure. But there's this like desire for younger people to be mentored by older people, but
they're not there.
They're not there.
Yeah, they're too busy. Yeah, and I can see it in my own life, the busyness of it. At my old church, we made a point where the older guys and the younger guys would do that. And I thought that was a really encouraging thing, because younger guys want to know, okay, I've got a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. What's it going to be like when they're teenagers? Who can help me walk that process? How do I deal with them now at 5 and 8? When do I give them an iPad? What am I,
Yeah.
And what happens, I think, in life is that, and this is not a criticism, it's work, the have-tos of life between the ages of about 35 and 50 can shred you if you're not careful.
Yeah.
And you have to navigate those ages, especially 35 to 50, very carefully, or you may not end up being Christian at the end of them. And I'm 56. I see that all the time.
Yeah.
And the best men I know, the most influential, are the quiet, steady men who turn up every week at church and look out for, and I've got their, Terminator 2 glasses on, scanning the room to see who needs to be talked to, who needs loved, who needs care, who needs attention. And I think that's when you've got that, you've got more financial capital, perhaps, you might be pressed, but you've also got more social capital that you can expend on other people.
Yeah.
And we don't think that way.
No.
Instinctively. We think, I've got all this freedom now, how can I use it for myself? Now, hang on, that's not the point.
Yeah.
And that is very hard to break.
And that's another cultural narrative that is fed, that how can you work for your freedom and then you use your freedom for yourself.
Yes, but every step you take, it was at T.S. Eliot said, is a step toward the block. You're going to die. And so, and I hate to say that, on this bright sunny Perth day where everyone's heading down to the beach, you're all doomed, people, you're all going to die. But Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, that needs a comeback, because he says Western society is very bad at it.
Yeah.
And that we'd be much more sobered and we'd live better if we thought about our deaths rightly, and we'd use our time better. And there's a great little book that I think picks up the eyes of that by Alan O. Noble, called On Getting Out of Bed, which just, the title says everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that idea of I've been reading a bit in terms of like the time frames in life, or the different stages you go through in life, and being able to be present in each of those stages. And one of them is, as you get older, it's approaching your death. And I think just like with Tim Keller's recent passing, I think that's something he exampled really well. Yeah, exceptionally well in a Western culture that, like you said, that doesn't talk about it, doesn't know how to approach it, and it's this thing that we're all marching towards.
I know. But step towards the block every day.
We sort of close our eyes and hope that it doesn't happen to me.
Well, we craft this life. If you go up to Mindari Marina, which we went to for last year over summer, and you've got the wind and the waves on the west coast, and then you've got this crafted, sheltered bay called Mindari, where it's a life of ease and comfort with big houses and beautiful restaurants. But the wind and waves of reality are on the other side. And the point of the Western life seems to be to craft your own version, your own personal Mindari Marina life. But every now and then a wave is going to wash over the top. So I think, how do you reach someone in a city where everyone's got everything?
Yeah.
Suffering always kicks in somewhere in someone's life. And that can be, as C.S. Lewis says, God's way is megaphone for rousing a deaf world.
Yeah.
You just never know. When people, you meet someone who's become a Christian, you go, how does that happen in the West? Well, I think God's still working.
Yeah. I love it. I was just thinking, I've got a quote behind you. I'm pretty sure it's C.S. Lewis, but it goes along. If you look for truth, you'll find comfort, or you may find comfort, but if you look for comfort, you'll neither find, I can't remember. You'll pretty much find disappointment in the end.
So the byproduct of looking for truth is comfort, right? But not the other way around.
Yeah, can't do it the other way around.
And you'll go into denial in order to seek comfort.
Yeah.
That's why we have an addiction problem in the Western world.
Yeah, that's very true. I love the conversation we're having, and there's so many different things I'd want to pick your brain further on, just aware of time. One of the final questions I have, so you mentioned that you're you love writing. Obviously, you've written a book. It's been really successful as well, and you've got another one coming, and you do blogs as well. And what are your thoughts on, this is totally left center, what's your thoughts on ChatGPT or AI and that whole side of creativity and being a writer influencing how you might approach that?
I was asked that question the other day. In one of the chapters in Futureproof, here's a
little teaser.
I start one of the chapters saying, this chapter was written by ChatGPT. Not really, but could you tell? Could you tell? And the question I think is, you can tell. Here's what makes writing memorable. It's the blips on the landscape, as I call it. It's when you're reading ChatGPT, it feels like it was all put into a blender and blended so that you can drink it like a milkshake. Good writing goes left and right. It takes unexpected turns, and it uses, how did it bring that image and that image together in such a way that they would never go together, but they make sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's what writing's supposed to do. And I wrote an essay on this theological college years ago called Turning Teflon into Velcro, Making Words Stick in an Image-Based Age. Because so many words are like Teflon.
Yeah.
They just slide off the side. And the point of writing well is to make them like Velcro, that they stick.
Yeah.
I challenged ChatGPT to come up with that concept. So good writing will always last. And vanilla writing, it's always been here. And George Orwell wrote an essay called The Politics of the English Language. And Don Watson, who was Paul Keating's speechwriter, wrote a book called Weasel Words. And both of those texts are about just the vanilla writing that you can avoid. And both those men are great writers and well read. So people will read good, memorable writing. And that's a theological thing as well, because remember that Jesus spoke as one with authority, and not as the scribes. The scribes probably said as many words, but they didn't have the authority. And I think it's Jesus' authority was obviously he was the Son of God, but it's also how he put things.
Yeah.
You can't read what Jesus said. So much of our language, even Richard Dawkins, who isn't a Christian, is a hard atheist, says you can't do English without knowing the Bible because of the concepts and the way all those things came in. Shakespeare and the Bible.
I love it. ChatGPT is just vanilla.
It's vanilla and it's Teflon.
It's vanilla and it won't stick. Yeah.
So there's a band. There's your rapper name, Vanilla Teflon.
Very good. Well, it's been an absolute privilege and I've enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for giving the time as well. I'd love to have another conversation sometime as well, just to pick your brain further. But yeah, it's been great, Steve. Hope you've enjoyed yourself.
Oh, Caleb, it's been great sitting watching the hot bird sun out the window in a nice air-conditioned room, but it's been a great conversation. Thanks for having me.